When François Mitterrand came along, I had studied a bit more, a bit of politics. I had especially tried to inform myself a little about where François Mitterrand really came from, who called himself a socialist at the time, but who, all the same, had been awarded the Order of the Francisque of Honor under Marshal Pétain in Vichy after all. And to be awarded the Order of the Francisque of Honor during Marshal Pétain's time, you had to write a letter of allegiance to the Marshal. That's something people should know. So that had caught my attention a bit back then, when François Mitterrand was elected in 81. Only the National Front, but the National Front wasn't considered respectable, so only the National Front had called it out, and rightfully so, because the information is true. It's verifiable on the internet, you can find it. But it wasn't something people wanted to talk about. And that's when I thought, oh, look, censorship is already happening, since no one was allowed to criticize François Mitterrand. Being the so-called good socialist that he was untouchable. But in reality, he had just switched sides, like in Dutronc's song, always on the winning side. What you also need to understand is that France is under Atlanticist domination, meaning under American influence. We are, Anglo-Saxon, I would say, since Pompidou. That is to say, the only president France has ever had who wasn't an Atlanticist was General de Gaulle. After him came Pompidou. Pompidou was already bought by the Americans. Since we still remember the 1973 law, known as the Rothschild Law, because Pompidou at the time had gone through Rothschild. And they brought us the so-called Rothschild Law, which, to put it simply, before this law, the French state could borrow from the Bank of France at almost zero interest. To keep it brief, after this so-called Rothschild Law, the state continued to borrow from the French bank, but with a lot of interest. So that was the beginning of the end. So there was Rothschild, then Giscard came after, and then came the Mitterrand era. And I don't know if people noticed, but I did, and I think quite a few others did too. But since the so-called socialist rise to power, when everything was supposed to be good for us, in France we still had to deal with tax increases like we had never seen before, and that was the beginning of the end. Anyway, those 2 5-year terms. Mitterrand's term was already a bit of a blow. There was a right-wing minister, and from time to time there was a left-wing minister. There were still some rather shady affairs under Mitterrand. There were also some rather strange suicides. Here I'm referring to Bérégovoy and François de Grossouvre, right in the middle of the Élysée Palace, by the way. And then there were all the money scandals involving Mitterrand's friends and so on. And then we had Jacques Chirac. François Mitterrand, in any case, always denied being pro-Atlanticist, but in reality he was. What you need to understand is that ever since de Gaulle left power, de Gaulle was pushed out of power because 68 is presented to us as a friendly revolution and so on. In reality, it was a coup d'etat orchestrated by the CIA behind the scenes. They absolutely wanted to sweep General de Gaulle aside because General de Gaulle was, in any case, deeply anti-American. And with good reason, by the way. And with good reason because it's not that I'm 100% behind General de Gaulle, but on this point, he was clear-sighted. He knew that, in any case, the United States was going to get a foothold, was going to set foot in Europe. Well, they had already set foot in Europe, but that they were going to keep on plundering us and plundering Europe. What you have to understand, let me go back a bit, in 1917, the Americans supposedly came to save us from the war. The 1914-18 war, the great slaughter of 1914-18. In reality, they didn't come to save us at all, because at the time, in 1917, the French and the British, who were allies then, were on the verge of winning. That vile war, that senseless war. In fact, the Americans didn't come to help us. They pretended, they polished their image a bit. But above all, they set foot in Europe so they could start plundering and controlling it more easily, something they've been doing since 1917. Then 1939, the collapse of the French and British armies. Everyone knows about that. 1940, the American government secretly made contact with the Marshal, Pétain, in Vichy, to begin laying the groundwork for a French and European protectorate after the war, because the Americans had already anticipated that the Allies would win this war against Germany. So in 1940, there were already negotiations between the American government and Marshal Pétain to establish an American protectorate over France at the end of the war. They even printed franc dollars. The project was called AMGO. It was AMGO, Military Alliance. I can't quite remember exactly what the acronym stands for. And in reality, at the end of the war, when the Allies won, mainly thanks to the Russians, by the way, because the Americans, well, anyway, let's move on, but they arrived with their funny money. With the franc dollars, they said, that's it, France is now under protectorate. And General de Gaulle, for his part, opposed this along with a few commissioners at the time. He said, there is no way you are going to take France. At face value, out you go. And he threw them out, telling them, take your funny money and go elsewhere. In 1966, General de Gaulle pulled us out of NATO. France said, that's it, goodbye Americans, I don't want you anymore. So for the Americans, General de Gaulle had to be removed, which is what they did in 68. It was provoked.